to Tiny House Fest Vermont. First year. Woo! I'm Erin Miley O'Keefe, and this is Lisa Kuhneman, and we also have another cohort, Betsy Hall, who's around. And I guess it was maybe 5 months ago, we said, I was holding little tiny house talks in my house, and Betsy said, we should do a festival. And I was like, I don't know, I'm building a tiny house this year. That's like, seems kind of crazy. And then she said it again. And then the third time she said it, I was like, okay, let's do it. And here we are. So thanks for turning out. Lisa wanted me to remind you about is on the Indiegogo site, we're crowdfunding this festival. A house that myself and many generous hands, including my husband, in the last 6 days, we built the paper boat house, which is the SIP house over there. And that's going to be done this fall. And if you want to stay in it in May of next year, you can go on the Indiegogo site. You know more about that. You want to say a little bit about that?
Sure. There are one-night opportunities and two-night opportunities to stay in Miley House. There are some images that if you haven't already gone over, and I think they're posted over there as well, you can take a look at what the finished house is going to look like. I don't think you've seen anything else out there like it. If you've seen a lot of tiny houses, this one's definitely unique. So, it's a great opportunity because once Erin and Kevin move in, I think that opportunity will be gone. So, thanks for coming and making it what it is.
So, and like Lisa said, this festival is really about integrating into downtown Brattleboro. So we're really encouraging also the restaurants throughout Brattleboro have Tiny Bites menus, which is why we don't have food vendors here. So please, if you're not from Brattleboro or you are from Brattleboro, take a walk through the town and support our local businesses.
That's part of what makes it great. We do have sponsors that are helping. Being the first year, anything that starts up the first time, people want to see a track record, and then they get on board. So we do have a few brave sponsors I'd like to mention. Manny's TV and Appliance has been very generous. We really, not only with financial support, but just a fantastic online cheerleading campaign. So we appreciate that very much. We have sponsorship from Chroma Tech up in Bellows Falls and from Recycle Away. They have containers for recycling. Usually see them in public places and schools, public buildings. And they're centered right here in Brattleboro. We have a list of partners, local partners, that is, every time I look at it, I can't believe it. Really want to shout out to the Latches Hotel. Their support has been incredible. They knew what we were after when we said we wanted to be in this space. They understood what we were trying to do in the way of imagining how our spaces could be used. And they got on board and were very supportive.
All right, welcome. 2 o'clock session, housing needs and creative communities. I wrote my stuff down to leave more time for the really smart people to talk. My name is Jen Stromsten. I'm from Greenfield, Massachusetts, Flatlander. Thanks for having me. Today you're going to hear from Rod Francis, who's the Brattleboro planner. He can talk about zoning. As he said, Candace Pearson from Building Green, MJ Adams, a Greenfield planner, and Becca Balint. I'll tell you a little bit more what they're going to say soon. So when it comes to creative approaches to getting things done on a large scale, like these guys are rock stars. They do big stuff. All right. I want us to think today about scale, because tiny homes are part of a conversation, like a big conversation we need to be having about housing needs, big challenges we're facing, and there's a lot of potential to be transforming our communities to be more sustainable, to be more beautiful, to be more attractive and vibrant, and this is part of that. So I want you to think about creativity in a lot of different ways, including technical stuff like zoning. My life story fits with this topic sort of nicely. My mother was a photographer, and I was dragged around to things like van rallies and RV parks while she was doing this book when I was a child. I've seen it all. I've seen every application of shag carpeting you've ever heard of. And other stuff at van rallies. I also was living in Greenwich Village in West Bath, which was an artist community that was founded in the 70s with some federal money and some private foundation money. They converted an old Westinghouse factory to be affordable live-work spaces for artists. It's still there. Diane Arbus lived there and died there. I want you to think about something that relates to West Bath, which is their waiting list has been closed since I was a young adult. Vermont's housing waiting list for affordable housing has been closed for many, many years. And this matters, because part of the tiny home thing is about affordability and accessibility. So today, I want us to think about what we can do with tiny homes and what we want to do in our communities. So the 4 panelists are going to cover this from some different angles, sort of the system problem. Rod is going to touch on sort of how we can adapt communities to better fit people's needs and how we do that through our regulatory processes. We have a lot of historic homes built for huge families and cheap energy, and they've been sort of adapted and cut up, but we have evolving demographics, aging population, and neighborhoods that need to do like a lot more for more people. So that's sort of what Rod's going to cover. MJ is actually going to follow, and she's going to talk about how, as individuals, our housing needs change, and sort of through our life stages, and talk about how this touches on issues of physical and financial accessibility and how homes connect us to communities, to nature, and also potentially kind of liberate us to live more creative lives, hopefully. So she's going to talk about our changing housing needs from sort of the personal perspective. And then, remember I said we're going to think big, which is funny at a tiny homes conference, but obviously I don't mean like McMansions. I mean, big in terms of what we can get done in the years to come if we keep thinking in this way, in ways that are sort of exciting and new. So in terms of, we want to think about how we can welcome a new generation of Vermonters and how they're going to make a life here. It's going to look a little bit different from the last generation and the generation before, right? And in the process, we're going to revitalize neighborhoods, we're going to attract investment. And if we do this in a green way, we're going to reduce our collective impact on the planet. And then there might be a planet for them, which would be terrific. So Candace is going to touch on sustainability and what the next generation needs from us, frankly. And last but not least, I want us to think expansively and generously, and I think this word applies especially to Becca, about who we're planning for and like what is attainable. What does attainability mean? One of the themes of the conference, and how we can all live sort of more sufficient, great lives, not burdened by cost and care, and living more creatively. So Becca's going to talk about sort of how tiny homes fit with Vermont's future and the challenges that Vermont is facing right now. Handing it off to Rod.
Hello, everybody. My name is Rod. I'm the planning director of the town of Brattleboro, and I'm very happy to be here today. And just in the same spirit as Jen, I've been interested in alternative forms of construction and do-it-yourself approaches to residential construction for a long time, since I was a teenager. And I've grappled with issues associated with doing that physically and directly, personally, but also now in my job as planning director, I spend a lot of time working with people who are trying to solve really complex problems about how to meet certain standards and how to make their dreams real, but also affordable, and confront housing affordability issues frequently, and work with a number of great local organizations who are dedicated to resolving those problems, but also people who are trying to resolve these issues independently and deal with questions of their ecological footprint and so forth through conscious choices. One of the aspects I think that's appealing about tiny homes is that you can literally put your arms around these things, that people can feel as if it's a level of technology and complexity that they can work with directly, that they don't need to depend on professionals or experts, that they don't necessarily even need to do complicated financing to achieve their dreams. And I think that those are the appealing aspects of it for many people. And so what I want to do today is, I'm actually here for this session and the following session. The following session I'm actually going to be available to address people's direct questions about what it takes to get a permit for a tiny house. But right now what I want to do is actually just give a thumbnail sketch of housing need and the character of housing in Brattleboro, and show people where there are potentially some opportunities. The first thing to know about Brattleboro that's a little more intense than many other communities is that we have a very large percentage of very old homes. So there's sort of so-called traditional neighborhoods, the ones that are immediately around us here, a couple of miles strung out along Route 9, but then to the north and the south of us are predominantly older homes. Many have been turned into apartments. Some of them were built as apartment buildings way back in the 1800s and early 1900s when Brattleboro was much more of a mill town than it is now. So our built form is old-style New England mill town, where people would have walked to work or maybe caught a bicycle, ridden a bicycle. There was a trolley car up and down Main Street. So you had this really close, tight fit between where people lived and where people worked. You had the gendered experience of employment, young girls and women working physical jobs in mills and so forth until they got married perhaps, and then being the caregiver at home. Men working long hours, lots of shift work. So all those sort of things are actually, all that experience is woven into the homes. You can sort of feel it when you walk through them. You can see it in the streets. We don't live like that anymore. We have cars, we work remotely, we do a whole bunch of things that are different. We have different gender assignments and gender roles with regard to employment and social activity. All these things are sort of smooshed into a built form that is Victorian in many ways. And so there are some conflicts there, but there are also some really cool features that come from that, including it being pretty compact and walkable, and that you don't need a car if you can figure out how to live and work in the same town. So there's some other issues here that are also interesting. About 46% of all dwelling units in Brattleboro are rental properties. This is actually extremely high. When you look at the county level, home ownership rates and rental rates are about the same as the national average. But Brattleboro is better thought of because it's a sort of a service center and a hub town, has been the kind of community that you might expect to see around a railroad station or something in a large metropolitan area like Boston. So it is where people get their services, where they get things fixed, and where there are denser levels of residential living and lots of apartments and lots of rental properties, which suggests a couple of interesting and complicated things. We're dealing with a lot of households in transition. We're dealing with a lot of households that are single-person households. And we're dealing with a lot of households that are at or below the poverty level. And so in the downtown area of Brattleboro in particular, all those characteristics are true. What this means for the tiny house movement is actually interesting. So I think in many ways, people look at the tiny house movement as a solution to some of the complex social problems that manifest in housing: overcrowding, poor quality housing, lack of control over your destiny. You don't know when the landlord is going to kick you out, or the owner is going to return to the home and your lease is going to end. You don't know if you can afford the increase in the rent rate next time around when the lease is re-signed. All these kinds of things actually play out on the street to some extent here, and if you work like I do, you begin to see it as sort of a daily pattern. The tiny house, I think, offers many people a kind of relief from that, the hope that you could have more control over your housing future and your resources. The challenge here is that if you're thinking about what we would call a Greenfield site, a piece of land where it's blank, basically it's undeveloped, then the cost of actually servicing the land and then buying or building a tiny house to fit gets pretty high pretty fast. The more probable solution for many people is to actually treat a tiny house as an RV and then park it in the backyard of somebody else's house, or a single setting, or the project, the wheel pad that we see here. Brattleboro's zoning regulations are pretty flexible around this. We allow RVs to be parked in people's yards as long as they are fully registered and roadworthy and insured, so that if they need to be moved, they can be moved, it's okay. Typically what ends up happening after some time is we get some kind of complaint from a neighbor or something, and then there's an intervention. Frequently that leads to the RV leaving. And it's around the kinds of things that we all should reasonably expect. They run a generator all hours of day and night to power the RV. They are not dealing with their waste properly. Their noise is interfering with the people next door. Those kinds of issues are not unique or exclusive to RVs, but it's a moment where we would intervene. We get about 2 or 3 complaints with what I would describe as conventional RVs in a year. We haven't had one about a tiny house. We think that done well and done sensitively, and where people are considerate and thoughtful, it's a viable option. The most likely option is actually what we would call an accessory dwelling unit. This is the kind of structure, it could be a tiny house, or it could be a converted barn, it could be a converted garden shed, it could be a new small structure in a backyard, as long as it meets certain design guidelines with regard to the distance from the fence line, and it meets code in terms of being hooked up properly, then we basically don't have an issue. So what I want to just conclude with, and I'm happy to take questions from people either on the housing need question or ability of people to start a tiny house project later, is that we think it's a meaningful solution. We like the idea of people being able to actually manage the project of this scale themselves, and so we see it as very appealing. We think it's got some community building and intentional community attributes that are interesting to explore, and we would be happy to support not-for-profit groups who wanted to try and build a tiny house community in an appropriate setting. But we think that if it's going to be a long-term viable structure, then it's best thought of as an accessory dwelling unit, and a longer list of standards apply. We think that the RV setting is probably okay for maybe 1 or 2 seasons of winter, and then everybody's going to feel like maybe they need to find somewhere a little bit warmer or something. That's our experience, that people can do it for a little while and then it gets really hard. So with that, I'm going to pass it on.
Great. Thank you, Rod. My name is MJ Adams. I'm the Community Development Administrator for the town of Greenfield, Massachusetts. Thanks for mentioning Greenfield already. Anyways, one of the things we say down in Massachusetts, if you want to try something new and creative and innovative, just go north and see what Vermont's up to.
We send it back to you.
So I was very excited to be able to come up here and to learn. I've learned so much this afternoon already, but I also hope that given this new sort of synergy that we have between Greenfield and Brattleboro and the new Green Building, Green Energy Excitement and Innovation Center, that we can really capitalize on each other's creative juices that are flowing. So my background is really affordable housing. I came at it about 30 years ago out of grad school and have been working in a variety of realms, the most recent one as the Community Development Administrator for the town of Greenfield. Prior to that, I was working at the regional housing organization in Franklin County, where I was working with a number of elders, a number of homeowners throughout the county, helping them upgrade their homes. And then before that, I served for 12 years as the executive director of Pioneer Valley Habitat for Humanity down in Hampshire and Franklin County. We used to joke way back when they first started talking about tiny houses that people should just turn around and look at Habitat, because that is the initial design concept with Habitat, that modest, small-sized homes are affordable. And so affordable is always in my equation. As I've been working in affordable housing in Massachusetts over the years, I've been fascinated by what I call the concept of the cost of housing per occupied moment and how that changes over time. As a household forms, you've got maybe one couple sharing some space. Young kids get introduced into the household. They need a little more space. Those kids grow up, become school-aged teenagers, they need a lot more space, and then, oops, they're gone, unless they come back and land at home after whatever. But you see this need for housing space and living space, shared living space, expand and then contract. And then you get to the point where the kids are permanently out of the household, and you're there either as a couple or alone, and you've got this huge house that you're suddenly trying to figure out how to keep it up, how to manage it, both financially and physically. And that's where I frequently played a role for many homeowners in Franklin County, as they had these huge homes that they couldn't afford to maintain, replace the roof, even get the snow shoveled sometimes. And what are we doing? At the same time, I was also taking a look at the housing needs of elders in Franklin County, and we really were seeing a trend where the median age in Franklin County is just skyrocketing. Well, slowly skyrocketing. And really slow. People are slowly aging in place, yes. But the reality is that a number of elders were saying, I used to live in this big house out in the woods, and I need to live closer to some place that's a little more manageable for me, closer to the village center. And then we started to look at the housing that's really available there, and there's not a good match. There's not a lot of small units in the village centers in Franklin County. And in Greenfield, as we were having this conversation, it was really clear to us as we were trying to revitalize downtown Greenfield that we wanted a walkable, livable community. Greenfield just completed a major master planning process about 1.5 years ago that said, we want more people living in the downtown. What are we going to do about that? And part of it is trying to sort of open up our horizons and figure out what other housing types we can do in Greenfield. And then to take the next step also and say, not just in Greenfield, but how can we serve as a leader, as a model, as a pilot for housing changes that need to happen in Massachusetts to allow greater diversity and flexibility in meeting people's housing needs as they age over time, we used to call it aging in place, we're now calling it aging in community, because we're realizing that the physical structure that people are living in right now might not be what they need or want for the long term. So how do we keep them in community, but provide flexible housing spaces for them that meet their needs and also respect the character of the community? That's what I'm so excited about, this tiny house conversation. At first I thought it was just a couple of geekers, just talking about tiny houses. But this summer, the local library, unbeknownst to me, did this, advertised they were doing a talk on tiny houses. 50 people showed up to talk about that in Greenfield. That blew our socks off. Unfortunately, the presenter didn't show up, so I came back the next month and did shared what I knew about it, and had the good fortune of tapping Louis Hasbrook, who's the building commissioner in Northampton, Massachusetts, to come and talk about the code issues. Because, like I said, in Massachusetts, if we can regulate you, we will, and we will be very adamant and robust in doing that. So everyone's question was, how small can the small houses be? So the code issues are there and they're present, but it was a really interesting conversation, and what I saw was a real energy and excitement about introducing small, tiny houses more into the fabric of the community in Greenfield. So that's what we're looking to do. We're looking to do it in 2 realms. First of all, we just changed our zoning so we can do accessory dwelling units. We can do standalone accessory dwelling units in the neighborhoods that are closer to the downtown. They are by special permit. And as I say to everybody, when we say tiny house in Greenfield, we are talking about a house on a permanent foundation. We are not talking about your mobile tiny houses. Although, I think that we should find a place where you should be able to convert a mobile tiny house to a permanent tiny house in Greenfield, and I'm going to be working on that solution. But so we have accessory dwelling units by special permit of the planning board. Like I said, permanent foundations only. And as I say to everyone in Greenfield, an accessory dwelling unit can be a tiny house, but it doesn't have to be a tiny house. So we're having some interesting conversations, and clearly the media down in the Springfield area can get themselves whipped into a frenzy when they hear the term tiny house. We had the woman in Hadley who had a tiny house, who they didn't change the zoning in Hadley, and she had to vacate. She had a mobile tiny house. So the question is, how can we do this more effectively? So there's the accessory dwelling units in Greenfield. I want you to get the sense that we welcome the conversation Foundation with open arms. We haven't done one yet, but I'm looking to see that that happens in the next year or so. The other exciting piece is, as a planner, you can plan till the cows come home, but until somebody builds what you've been talking about and planning for, it doesn't feel very real. So one of my other responsibilities in Greenfield is to take this site that we have just south of the town. It's about a quarter mile south of the transit center, very close to our downtown. It is now town-owned land. It had been a little bit of a distressed neighborhood with some condemned and burned out houses. The town has acquired the land. We're taking down the houses. And we will be putting out a request for development, asking somebody to step forward and to propose a tiny/small house on permanent foundations in Greenfield over the next year. We're looking to have 7 units. 7 homes. We're hoping for home ownership that would be built. I'm very interested in talking with anyone who wants to scale up and talk about a small house community or bungalow community, because we'd really like to make this concept real by having a piece of town-owned land that's ready to go with water and sewer in a beautiful location close to downtown Greenfield, and a community that really wants to sort of test drive this new concept and seems open and willing to that. There. That's sort of, and if anyone wants more detail on the site, I have it right here. I'm happy to talk with anybody about it. But the idea is that we're also going to be introducing affordability into that concept. Of the 7 homes that will be built there, we'll ask that 4 of them be affordable, so there's some availability for market rate. It sits on the Green River. It's close to downtown. It's a great location, and I hope that anyone who's thinking about this, either individually building a tiny house or being a developer of a small tiny home community, finds their way to me. Thank you.
Awesome. That's really exciting. So I'm going to be talking about how tiny homes fit within the context of larger communities with 2 hats on today, and I'll try to balance between the 2. One is going to be from the environmental perspective. So I work with Building Green currently, and Building Green is a partner of the Ecovation Hub, and we actually have a demonstration that's in the Latches library, in the Latches lobby, excuse me. So if you haven't been over there to see the little video, you definitely should. And that project is all about pulling partners together who are in the green economy or in the green building sphere to create economic development that is in a sustainable way. So we're really excited about this tiny house movement because we feel like those kind of contractors and those kind of builders could be part of that economic development. And the second hat that I'm going to be wearing while I talk about the second portion of my talk is the Young Professionals Steering Committee, which is related to the BDCC, and where it's a Southern Vermont chapter. So I'm going to, I'm not exactly the experts as Rod is, but I'm going to be putting that hat on and kind of talking about my experience about living in Brattleboro as a millennial, and the housing needs that our group feels is important for the next couple of years. So I'm going to start with the environmental side, and I think everyone recognizes that the tiny house movement was driven from an environmental aesthetic when it first started, and I think no one can argue that it's not a green way to live. Whether it's a smaller footprint, whether you're using less energy, and you're also using less building materials in the first place. And that third one is really key for me, because what we're learning in our green building work is that it takes 15 years of operating a building, a normal, conventional building, for its energy use to equal the amount of energy it took to produce that building in the first place. So that's all the energy it took to make the building materials and to transport them to the site. So when we're trying to reduce our carbon impact, we know that we need to actually really pay attention to that embodied energy if we're going to make a difference on global warming. So yeah, that embodied energy is going to be huge, and tiny homes are a tool that I think is going to be really important to do that, but it's also an argument for renovating existing homes, for example, or just using what materials you might have, reusing materials for new housing. So, but I also think that there's some issues that get lost in the tiny home conversation sometimes, and those are mostly the larger context issues. So one of those is transportation energy, right? So we're learning that in the most efficient buildings right now, big commercial buildings, it's actually more energy use is used in the people transportation energy to that building. It's going to be the same with tiny homes. If you're building a tiny home that's 20 miles away from where you work and you're commuting every day, you might have a smaller carbon footprint if you lived in an apartment downtown. So, when we're using this as an argument for building tiny homes, I think we need to be considering that larger context. And it makes a great case for people who are working to integrate tiny homes into urban fabrics, into walkable downtown communities. So energy use is one of those. I'm also thinking about how new land development outside of urban centers has the same kind of connotations if you're parcelizing the land and dividing up habitat use. So we have to think about those issues too. Even if it's a smaller home, you're still going to be having some of those problems. So in terms of the kind of changing housing questions and what the new generations might need, I think that in Brattleboro, at least, Rod talked a little bit about the kind of situation we're facing with a split, almost even split between homeowners and renters. And my experience in Brattleboro has been that there's a lot of market incentives for people to buy up housing, divide it into apartments, and become the landlord for those apartments, and put in as little money as possible to maintain those apartments, because they're making money off of the renting to those. They're making money off of being the landlords, and they're not thinking about the value of that home when they sell it. So what that makes it really hard for people like me to do is buy an affordable first-time home. So I think tiny homes have a really great potential to help relieve some of that pressure. If people need additional income, they might be able to put an accessory dwelling unit on their house, and that way that might provide an additional income stream. It might allow for more flexibility if you need a mother-in-law apartment, things like that. And I think it might help keep some of these affordable, smaller homes intact. And that would create a bigger market for younger people to come in and buy first-time homes close to downtown. So I think that's a kind of important thing to note. And the other thing is, tiny homes themselves, right, appeal really strongly to millennials. It's been documented that millennials have really strong environmental ethics and, really relate to responsible sourcing and things like that. So the movement itself has the potential to bring people that this area needs pretty desperately. We're noticing that the age of employed workers is increasing, and we're not bringing younger people in to work in this economy as much. So things like this new Greenfield development might attract those younger people to come in and work here. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is that if we do have things like tiny home communities that might have some shared services, so for example, when you were talking about the community, I would think there might be a shared kitchen or a shared communal space. And one of the things that we're noticing in our young professionals group is that some young professionals come here and they work for a year, and they don't leave because they lose a job or they can't afford it here. They leave because they haven't been socially connected, and they might not be able to find partners, or they have a trailing spouse who can't find work, or they just simply don't have a social support group here, and they're seeing the Facebook posts from their friends in the cities who are going out to bars every weekend. So for us, that's a big indicator that if we can connect younger people when they come here and give them that social support, then they'd be more likely to stay. So tiny homes have the ability to do that because they've got more flexibility in creating communal spaces. So I think that's a really promising role for them as well.
I'm Becca Balint. I'm one of the 2 state senators that represent Windham County, and I just noticed that my colleague, Jeanette White, is also in the audience, and both of us care very deeply about housing in our county. So I had to laugh when Candace said, as a millennial, because I'm not a millennial, but I play one at the legislature. I've been mistaken for a millennial, and I'm 48, okay, just for the record. I mention this because I think we often talk about these housing issues as if they only affect millennials and those folks who are looking for comfortable retirement homes. I'll tell you a little story about when I first bought my home here in Brattleboro. So I was just about 40. I was pregnant with our first child, and we could not find a house, a starter home for our family. When you put together the closing costs, when you put together the costs of the down payment, when you look at the housing stock, which Rod has talked about, we have a very old housing stock here throughout the Northeast, but especially here in our old neighborhoods in Brattleboro. We were looking at a 100-year-old home, which we did eventually buy, but you have to factor in that you're going to have to fix the knob and tube wiring. You're going to have to replace the windows. There's lead paint in all of the closets that you don't want your children playing in. So there's costs on top of that. So I had a good job. I was a teacher. I made a decent salary. I loved my job, and I had good benefits. And even with that, it was very difficult to find a home in this county that we could afford and that didn't need a ton of work. So just to put that in mind, I talk about housing issues a lot in the legislature. I serve on Economic Development and Housing General Affairs Committee in the Senate. That's one of my 2 committees. And I was having a really hard time talking about housing issues in the context of what our needs are right now on the ground in Vermont. And it was only until I said to my committee, I literally could not buy my first house until I was almost 40, was when folks in the room sort of cocked their head and said, oh, that's really different than my experience. And again, my costs for my education are nothing. They're nothing compared to the costs of our young folks coming up today. So just wanted to start with that story, because I'm here as a legislator, but I'm also here as someone who values this state and values this community, and I want it to be a place where people really can start a family and settle in. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say is that by any measure here in Vermont, we have a housing crisis, and a lot of people don't realize it. We have a vacancy rate of rental units throughout Vermont that is virtually non-existent, except for in little pockets like in Rutland. Rutland does have vacancy rates that are higher than the rest of the state. But in most of the state, if you're trying to rent, and if you're a renter in the audience, you know what I'm talking about. It's incredibly difficult. Businesses and nonprofits are having an incredibly hard time securing workers, and a big part of that is that they come here, they like the job, they like the community, they look around at the homes that are available to them at the price that they're available at, and they think, why would I do this? Why would I do this to my family? I can find housing that's in better shape and is more affordable where I'm coming from. So that is a real factor. It happens all the time where we bring people here to look at jobs, and they're concerned long-term about their kids staying here and where are they going to live. If the housing is this tight now, what's going to happen to my kids who are now in middle school or high school and they want to stay here? So that's the other piece of it. The housing issue also creates downward pressure. And what I mean by that is you have people in homes that are cheaper than they actually could afford, and apartments that they actually could afford, because that's what's available on the market. So they take up those homes, and then the folks who really need those more affordable apartments and more affordable houses cannot find them. So we talk a lot about affordable housing for folks who are working class and at the lower margins of the economic scale, but we really need to think more broadly about creating more housing in that sweet spot in the middle so that folks who can afford those homes are in those homes and not taking homes away from folks who really need a more affordable alternative. And I'm touching on a lot of things that other people have mentioned here, but one thing that hasn't come up here, which I think is incredibly important to remember, is here in Vermont right now, we have over 100 incarcerated Vermonters who are remaining incarcerated because we have no housing for them. That is the reason that they are still incarcerated. And so I know that most of us in this room, because I see the nodding of the heads, that's not tenable. That's not what we want as a society. So of course, there are always exceptions. There are some people that are violent offenders, or they have crimes that put restrictions on where they can live. But a huge chunk of this population cannot afford appropriate housing, so they remain incarcerated. And I know for me, it's something I'm going to continue working on in the upcoming legislative session, but this is a real problem, and it is indicative of the problem throughout the state. And it just happens to be a great talking point because we care about these people. So that's something else I didn't want to forget to mention. This session, I was lucky enough to partner with a representative from Addison, whose name was Fred Baser, and we were very like-minded about housing and how so many of our housing costs that make it just out of touch for the young family have to do with the infrastructure costs associated with the new build. And it's very difficult for new construction to happen and still remain affordable for families. So we wanted to have a pilot to see, could we construct them with the infrastructure costs taken off of the price tag of the house and having revolving either grant or loan fund at the state level to help alleviate those pressures. It did not pass in the last few days of the session because there were other programs that also needed the money. And although it was incredibly disappointing to me, I felt like it signaled to a lot of people that we need to start talking differently about how these problems are going to be solved. The market is not just going to take care of itself. It's not, because there is no margin for people to make a profit on building these affordable homes for younger families. We have to piece together a funding package that will make sense. So that's another piece I wanted to say. Now, one of the reasons I'm so interested in the tiny house movement is that it does bring up conversations like this. And I'm very curious whether tiny houses, and frankly not so tiny houses, can be solutions to some of these problems. They certainly can provide affordable housing for seniors, and we have, like in Greenfield, here in Windham County, we have a growing population of seniors that are going to need a different kind of housing that works for them, that gives them independence, but close to family and community. It could be, as I talked about earlier, a chance for us to provide folks who have been incarcerated or are about to be released a clean, affordable, safe place to start a new life for themselves. I see a lot of possibility in that. In tiny and small houses could be a new form or a new part of an existing form, which is mobile home parks, which have always been an affordable alternative to expensive Vermont. I'm also intrigued by the movement because it provides an outlet for all of us who have been alarmed that the average size of a single-family home in the U.S., and I'll make sure I get my numbers right because it astounds me every time, 1978, average home, 1,800 square feet, okay? Today, well, this was 2013 numbers, average home size, 2,600 square feet. And this at a time when the average family size is decreasing, right? So the tiny house movement really is a clarion call for all of us to say, what the heck are we doing? This makes no sense for the population we have and for the values that we have around community and family. But the ideas and the aesthetics and values can be adapted and adopted to thinking about how to use our existing housing stock, which many of us have touched on. And I also think that talking about tiny houses forces us to examine not just our needs around housing, but what community means to us and what we want it to mean to us. And how do we create community for the Vermonters in the next 20 and 30 years? How do we make this a place where all people feel like they can put a stake in the ground? And one of the things that I was thinking of is, if we look at the tiny housing movement, it's really less than 1% of the national real estate market. That doesn't mean it's not important at all. It means it's critically important because it pushes the conversation. But I really want to take these ideas and make them more transferable to the housing that we have and to the communities that we have so that we can get ourselves out of this mess, because I want to have a vibrant county and a vibrant state moving forward. And whether you're looking at economic development, if you're looking at diversity, it all comes back to housing. So I'm really grateful to be here. And now I think we're going to take questions.
this is where I'll pretend to be in charge. We have about 8 minutes for questions. And I just want to back it up further. A Levittown house was 750 square feet. So it's sort of doubled and doubled again, just to put it in perspective. And the federal government paid for most of that infrastructure, so to your point.
Can we take a few questions? I think the roving mic is tough, so if you shout it, I'll repeat it.
I'm very interested in how to approach creating, I guess, a legal and regulatory environment that's hospitable to tiny houses. I'm from Burlington, and Burlington, they're zoned out completely. We can't even, I mean, I've got in my mind a particular parcel where it can't be used for practically anything else. It would be an ideal place to set up tiny houses. Maybe a construction zone.
So that's a question, a regulatory pathway to make this more viable. And I think that should be answered at the municipal as well as the state level, if that's okay. I don't know which of you wants to. You guys can duke it out.
You're Vermont. You can do much more than we can.
Okay, so I think I'm down for even another session after this where I'm going to talk about these things really explicitly. So Vermont accessory dwelling units are basically a required element of municipal zoning regulation. So most municipalities in Vermont will have a section of their zoning bylaw that will allow for accessory dwelling units. Brattleboro, as it turns out, it had fairly liberal accessory dwelling unit language in its zoning bylaws for a long time. What we've done in the most recent iteration of our new zoning regulations, which were implemented in December, is to allow for planned unit developments and we use a template model, so depending on the planned unit development purpose, you select a template. One of those is cottage cluster, and we think that this is the most appropriate fit for tiny homes or tiny houses. So it could be an in-town parcel that's been difficult to develop for regular sized market value single-family homes, or it could have some access challenges or something similar. And the purpose of a planned unit development as a legal document for zoning purposes is that the applicant broadly works within the parameters laid down by the template, but things such as the distance between the buildings and so forth, and the number of buildings, all that's totally flexible in terms of the design. So what we would say there is that if you've got the right parcel and it meets some basic requirements, then that's the path that you would use, the regulatory path that you would use for us. In rural and rural residential districts of town, there's more flexibility basically coming from the larger parcel size. So there you're going to run into some issues about the total number of structures on a lot, but you could accommodate 2 or 3 tiny houses in a setting, I think, depending on the size of the parcel. So I can't speak for other municipalities, especially in Massachusetts, but I've got somebody here who can.
I'll speak to Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, we actually have a special permitting process called Comprehensive Permit, Chapter 40B. If you're doing affordable units, you have the opportunity to actually get some relief from the existing zoning regulations and do one-stop shopping, getting all your local permits in one process. On our Deerfield Street property, we're actually exploring assisting a developer who we might select do what we call a friendly 40B, which is where the town would actually partner with the developer to help navigate that process. So that's probably the easiest way to do it. Like I said, we're looking at this process at this site in Greenfield as a real opportunity to sort of figure out, now that the town owns the land, how can this play out so that it can work for other communities in Massachusetts, and using it as a pilot. But we do have that special permitting process. If we didn't have that, I don't know how it would go.
Can I just have this back for a second? I just want to make one point really clear. Most people, when they come into our office or email us or whatever, trying to get a zoning permit, are obviously focused on what they need and what they would like to do, and they've got a dream or a project in mind, and they've got a parcel that they've selected or that they already own, and they want to do what they want to do. And there's that somewhat nasty reminder here that ignorance is no defense before the law. So it's important to actually ask first and then make some decisions. The next part that is really important is that zoning is a form of community regulation that's intended, its intended purpose is to protect the health and safety of all residents and occupants of a community, and to develop land in an orderly way. So if you had a parcel that was in an industrial zoning district in Brattleboro and you wanted to put tiny houses on it, we're going to say no. We're going to say no for a couple of really important reasons. If it's been zoned industrial, it's suitable for industrial activity and construction, and it's got some virtues and some attributes that we think are important to protect for industrial uses. That would be proximity to the interstate, or water and electricity supply, or a bunch of other features that are really important to remember. And they're important to remember because we want jobs to happen in industrial districts, and we want structures and businesses to build in industrial districts, and we don't want to break that pattern up or compromise our ability to do economic development in the appropriate land use district by having it occupied by tiny houses or any other form of residential construction. So sometimes we get into actually blocking or regulating the kind of land use that people might feel is urgent or really an exciting prospect, because the community has already had a discussion and figured out that retail is going to happen over here, and industrial is going to happen over there, and then residential and agriculture is going to happen over here. And there's a reason for that, and you can change it, and things change over time, but it's a complex and a long process because it actually involves having a conversation or reopening a conversation with the community about, okay, what do we really want to do here? And so I just want to point out that often it's lost in the shuffle why we have land use regulations in the first place. And there are conflicts between land uses that we need to recognize and remember, and we need to hold on to the idea of what is the community attempting to achieve in the long term overall. So there's some background comments on why we zone, I guess. And I will Becca out.
I think we have 1 minute. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Yes.
I'm very excited to hear about the Greenfield project, one that you planned there. That's town land. So my question is that, Becca, I love what you said, that housing, I think, is truly the most important thing we have if we're to continue to thrive as a community. Is there anything like that being talked about or considered where town land might be used? Because as you said, there's really not much of a market reason for anybody to say, oh, I'm going to buy this piece of land and build because the market would be against that. So is there any town or municipal project?
The question is whether there are any town, local, municipal, similar projects to the Greenfield project being discussed or initiated. Ron, do you know? Speak to that.
No, I'm not aware of anything else, but yeah.
So this isn't about town land, but part of the Ecovation Hub is looking at how the community might develop something called the Living Community Challenge. And that's a type of development that considers net zero water and net zero energy. And I can imagine tiny homes being part of that picture, but currently right now we're shopping around for certain developments that might be a good fit for. So I'd encourage anyone to become involved in that community development project. Again, it's the Ecovation Hub and the Living Community Challenge, and tiny homes might be part of that picture depending on the site that's chosen.
Do you want to come work in Greenfield?
Would love to. Yes. Every young professional, senior, MJ. And all right, we're going to sneak in one more and make the next people mad at us. Oh, yeah, do you mind?
Yeah,
okay.
Okay, I'm not really sure how to word this question. It's more of a topic that I wonder would fall into this discussion, which is taxation. So, property taxes. If a tiny home is mobile, or an RV is mobile, and they're not using certain town services, but they're located on a property that, like a house, like there's so many tiny homes now parking in friends' homes, right, that are living there. Are there property tax implications?
Yeah. Yes, there are. And it's not such a huge issue for us right now because we're not really swamped by RV dwellers and driveways in Brattleboro. I talked to the town appraiser, the town assessor, Russ Rice, about this topic, and he said basically if it's road registered and insured and roadworthy, then they're not going to add it to the property taxes. That's the only way we would permit somebody actually dwelling in an RV in someone's backyard or driveway in Brattleboro. So you have to maintain it and insure it and have it ready to go, because we might say it's going now. So those are not subject to property taxes. That's personal property, and that's the end of that. If it's an accessory dwelling unit, it's subject to property tax. So the line sink unit here, the wheel pad, that could be subject to property taxes. There'd probably be room for seeking you would grieve it and probably get some kind of consideration if you could demonstrate, for instance, that a family member needs it because of a medical issue. But that would depend. But if it was that you convert the upstairs of your barn into a apartment or add a tiny house for rental income or for a family member to live in, it's going to be counted as part of the value of the property, and it will be taxed. And we like to find things to tax.
In Massachusetts, if you have a tiny house on a trailer or chassis, it's considered an RV. And for most communities, they will only allow you to park it there for 2 consecutive weeks. Then the building inspector will chase you away because your neighbors will call and complain about it. That's the reality. So you have to have a lot of friends in Massachusetts that you can drive around to and park for 2 weeks as you try to find a permanent location. Yeah, we'll send it right up over the border. And you will be, as an RV, it will be taxed as excise tax, the local taxes for vehicles. The other piece that I have lost, if, however, you are building a house or if your house is burned down and you're rebuilding, you can frequently get a permit to live there for a year. So have a shack, set it on fire. Yeah. Oh, I didn't say.
We'll just end on, I think we'll end on that note. No. Thank you. Thank you all so much.